Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to Baden-Baden in the first decades of the 20th century. A spa town nestled in the Black Forest, where Europe's elite came to take the waters, gamble at the casino, and pretend their secrets were safe in the steam. Where gay men walked the colonnades arm in arm, and no one asked questions. Until someone did. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In 1902, in the humid marble corridors of the Friedrichsbad bathhouse, a middle-aged banker from Frankfurt lowered himself into water so hot it made his skin flush red. The man beside him was younger, dark-haired, a university student from Berlin who had come south for the summer. They had not exchanged more than a dozen words, but their knees touched beneath the water, and that, in Baden-Baden, was enough. The banker's name was Ernst Waldheim. The student was Karl Fischer. Neither of them would become famous, but both of them would return to Baden-Baden every summer for the next decade, along with hundreds of other men who understood what the town offered. A temporary country where desire did not have to justify itself. To understand why no one cared, or why they cared just enough to look the other way, you have to understand something about Baden-Baden that most histories of the era refuse to explain. This was a town that ran on secrets. The gambling alone would have been illegal anywhere else in Germany. The affairs, the fortunes lost at roulette, the married men who arrived with companions who were distinctly not their wives. Baden-Baden's entire economy depended on discretion. And so, when gay men arrived, the town simply extended the same courtesy it extended to everyone else. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you. But only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. And if you would like to sit closer to this quiet corner of history, closer to the letters, the archives, the little rooms where these men still whisper, there is a membership button below the video. Joining us there keeps this channel alive and keeps these stories being told, but only, of course, if it feels right for you. Now, let us go back to Baden-Baden. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know why a spa town became a haven when Berlin was still raiding gay bars, who the men were who built an entire summer society in the shadow of the casino, and what it took to make that fragile world collapse. Congratulations, you have just woken up in Baden-Baden. The year is 1905. The air smells like mineral water and expensive cigars. Somewhere nearby, an orchestra is warming up for the evening concert. The sun is filtering through linden trees, and every third man walking past you is either a duke, a banker, or pretending to be one. Welcome. The first thing you notice is the heat, not the weather, though August in the Black Forest can be stifling, but the thermal springs that gave Baden-Baden its name. The water here rises from deep beneath the earth, emerges at nearly 70 degrees Celsius, and has been doing so since the Romans built their baths on this exact spot 2,000 years ago. The entire town is built on top of a geological accident that makes the ground warm to the touch. Walk down Sophienstrasse on a winter morning, and you will see steam rising from the gutters. The second thing you notice is the money. Baden-Baden in 1905 is not a town. It is a stage set for Europe's wealthiest families to perform the theatre of leisure. Grand hotels line the Lichtenthaler Allee, their facades dripping with wrought iron and stained glass. The Kurhaus, the town's massive spa complex and casino, Looks like a Baroque palace had a baby with a cathedral. Inside, men in white tie lose more money in a single evening than a factory worker in Essen will earn in a year. Outside, their wives promenade in gowns that cost what a small farm might sell for. The historian Klaus Latzel, who spent years studying Baden-Baden's archives, found records showing that in the summer of 1904 alone, over 20,000 visitors passed through the town. In a place with fewer than 15,000 permanent residents, that meant the summer population was almost entirely transient. You could be anyone here. You could reinvent yourself with every visit. And for men whose lives elsewhere required constant vigilance, that anonymity was oxygen. The third thing you notice, if you know what to look for, is the men walking in pairs. Not unusual in itself. Male friendship in 1905 allowed for a degree of physical closeness that would read as suspicious a century later. Men linked arms, they strolled together. They sat close on park benches and no one blinked. But in Baden-Baden, the pairs had a particular quality. They lingered. They returned to the same cafe every afternoon at the same hour. They took adjoining rooms at the same hotels year after year. They had what the novelist Stefan Zweig would later call the unmistakable air of men who have found each other. Zweig himself was a regular visitor to Baden-Baden before the First World War. In his memoir, The World of Yesterday, he described the town as an island of another century, a place where the rigid social codes of Berlin and Vienna softened into something more forgiving. He did not write explicitly about the town's gay visitors. Zweig was writing in the 1940s, and even in exile, he knew what could and could not be said. But he wrote around it. He described men who came to Baden-Baden for reasons they never quite named. He wrote about friendships that bloomed with the intensity of love affairs, which perhaps they were. Let's be honest with each other for a moment. The direct evidence for Baden-Baden as a gay haven is fragmentary. No one was writing newspaper articles titled "Local Spa Town Popular with Homosexuals." The letters and diaries that survive are careful. The photographs show men standing close together, but photographs always do. What we have instead is a pattern, a constellation of suggestive details that, taken together, reveal a world that existed just beneath the surface of official history. Here is what we know for certain. Baden-Baden had at least 3 bathhouses that catered almost exclusively to men. The Friedrichsbad, opened in 1877, was the grandest, a Renaissance revival palace of marble and mosaic, where men bathed nude in a series of progressively hotter pools. The ritual took 3 hours. You moved from warm air baths to steam rooms, to hot pools, to cold plunges, and then you lay on heated marble slabs while attendants massaged you with horsehair brushes. It was intimate. It was sensual. And it was one of the few places in Imperial Germany where male nudity was not only permitted, but expected. The historian Robert Beechey, in his work on Gay Berlin, found police records from the 1890s showing that Berlin's bathhouses were under near constant surveillance. Plainclothes officers would sit in the steam rooms, watching for men who lingered too long, who made eye contact, who touched. In Berlin, taking a bath could get you arrested. In Baden-Baden, the same activity was considered a health treatment. The difference was not the behavior. The difference was that Baden-Baden's economy depended on letting wealthy visitors do what they wanted, as long as they did it quietly. Ernst Waldheim, the banker we met at the beginning, kept a diary. Fragments of it survive in a private collection in Frankfurt. In August 1903, he wrote, "Return to the Friedrichsbad this afternoon. The heat is almost unbearable, but one grows accustomed. Met the student from Berlin again. We spoke of Goethe. He has remarkable hands." That is the entire entry. No last name for the student. No mention of what happened after they spoke of Goethe. But Waldheim returned to Baden-Baden every summer until 1914. And the student who we know from other sources was Karl Fischer, because Waldheim mentions him by name in a 1907 letter to a friend, returned as well. They were not the only ones. The guest registers from the Hotel Stephanie, one of Baden-Baden's smaller but more discreet establishments, show patterns. Two men checking in together, listed as travelling companions, the same pairs, returning year after year, requesting the same rooms. In 1908, a man named Heinrich Müller and his companion, Josef Lang, stayed at the Stephanie for 6 consecutive summers. They gave their address as Munich, though city records there show no one by those names living at the addresses listed. They were, almost certainly, using false names, and the hotel staff almost certainly knew. And no one said a word. Because that was the deal. That was always the deal in Baden-Baden. The town would look the other way. The town would extend its protective discretion to anyone with enough money to rent a room and buy a season pass to the baths. In exchange, visitors would keep their affairs quiet. They would not cause a scandal. They would not force the town to acknowledge what it had chosen not to see. It was a fragile arrangement, but for 30 years it held. Let's talk about what gay men actually did in Baden-Baden, because the historical record gives us enough to reconstruct the rhythms of their days. You would arrive by train. The Baden-Baden station was, and still is, a small Baroque jewel box at the edge of town. You would step off the train into air that smelled like pine and sulphur. A porter would take your luggage. If you were staying at one of the grand hotels, a carriage would be waiting. If not, you walked. Baden-Baden is small enough that you can cross it in 20 minutes, check in at your hotel, unpack. Then, almost immediately, a walk. The Lichtenthaler Allee was the spine of the town, a tree-lined promenade that followed the little Ouse River from the Kurhaus south to the old monastery. It was 2.5 kilometers of gravel paths, rose gardens, and benches placed at intervals that suggested they were meant for lingering. Every afternoon between 4 and 6, the alley filled with visitors. It was where you went to see and be seen. It was also where you went to find someone. The signals were subtle. A glance held a beat too long. A pause on a particular bench. A book carried in the left hand rather than the right. The historian Florence Taman, in her work on interwar European gay culture, found references in French and German memoirs to what she calls the semiotics of cruising, a shared vocabulary of gestures and objects that allowed men to recognize each other without speaking. A green carnation in a lapel, popularized by Oscar Wilde. A certain style of walking, a copy of Platon's poetry carried conspicuously. These signals existed in Berlin, in Paris, in Vienna. They existed in Baden-Baden too. If the afternoon walk went well, the next step was the baths. The Friedrichsbad was the most popular, but it was also the most public. If you wanted privacy, you went to the Caracalla baths, a smaller complex built over Roman ruins. Or you went to one of the private bathing establishments that dotted the side streets off the Kurhaus. These were less grand, but they offered something the big bathhouses did not. Rooms you could rent by the hour, with doors that locked. Dinner was at your hotel or at one of the restaurants near the Kurhaus. Baden-Baden had a dining culture that rivaled Paris. The food was rich, the wine was French, and the dining rooms were designed for conversation. Men dined together, sometimes in groups of 4 or 6, sometimes just 2. A long dinner could stretch to 3 hours. Afterward, a walk back to the Lichtenthaler Allee, which in summer stayed lively until nearly midnight. Some men gambled. The casino at the Kurhaus was one of the most famous in Europe, a glittering hall of roulette tables and baccarat games where fortunes changed hands nightly. Dostoevsky famously lost everything he had at Baden-Baden's casino in 1867 and wrote The Gambler to pay off his debts. The casino's records show that it attracted a particular kind of clientele, men travelling alone, men with money to burn, men who were there as much for the social scene as for the gaming. The overlap with the town's gay visitors was not total, but it was significant. And then, late at night, back to the hotel, to adjoining rooms, or to rooms with connecting doors, or sometimes, when discretion allowed, to the same room. The architecture of Baden-Baden's hotels facilitated this. The Hotel Stephanie, which I mentioned earlier, was designed with privacy in mind. Its guest rooms were laid out in a way that minimized the number of doors visible from the central hallway. Servants' stairs allowed discreet movement between floors. The hotel's manager in the 1900s was a man named Otto Brendel, and his personal papers, preserved in the Baden-Baden city archives, include notes on special accommodations for guests who required additional discretion. He does not elaborate. He does not need to. Here is a specific day, reconstructed from sources. June 14th, 1907. 2 men arrived at the Hotel Stephanie on the morning train from Karlsruhe. Their names in the register are given as Paul Adler and Max Stein. They listed their residence as Frankfurt. They stayed for 9 days. On their first afternoon, they walked the Lichtenthaler Allee. A staff member at the Kurhaus recorded seeing them at the Friedrichsbad that evening. They dined at the hotel. The next morning, they attended a concert at the Kurhaus. The guest list survives, and their names are on it. Over the next week, they followed the same pattern. Baths, walks, dinners, concerts. On their final evening, they hosted a small dinner party in one of the hotel's private dining rooms. 4 other men attended, all of them guests at the Stephanie. The bill for the evening came to 87 marks, which Adler paid in cash. Then they left, checked out, took the train back north, and the historical record loses them. We do not know if Paul Adler and Max Stein were their real names. We do not know if they were lovers, friends, or something else. But we know they were there. And we know they returned the following summer, because the hotel register shows them checking in again on June 12th, 1908. Multiply that story by hundreds, thousands, maybe. That was the invisible city that existed within Baden-Baden. A summer city, populated by men who came for the waters and stayed for each other. Not all of them were discreet. Some were flagrant in ways that, looking back, seem almost reckless. In 1910, a man named Count Friedrich von Seckendorf arrived in Baden-Baden with an entourage that included 2 young men he introduced as his secretaries. Von Seckendorf was a minor aristocrat from Bavaria, wealthy enough to rent an entire floor of the Hotel Messmer. He threw parties, loud ones, late-night gatherings that spilled out onto the hotel's balconies, with music and laughter that carried down to the street. The police were called twice. Both times they declined to intervene. Von Seckendorf was a count. His guests were respectable. And this was Baden-Baden, where respectable people were allowed to make noise as long as they paid their hotel bills. The local newspaper, the Badener Tagblatt, ran a brief item in July 1910, noting that certain visitors to the town have been engaging in behavior that tests the patience of their neighbors. It did not name von Seckendorf. It did not need to. Everyone knew. Von Seckendorf returned every summer until 1913. Then the war came, and the whole world changed. But for 3 years, he was as close as Baden-Baden had to an openly gay public figure. He did not call himself that. The language did not exist yet, not in the way we use it now. But he lived as though the rules that governed other men's lives did not apply to him. And in Baden-Baden, for a while, they did not. Let's pause here and talk about the language, because it matters. In 1905, the word homosexual existed. It had been coined in 1869 by an Austro-Hungarian writer named Karl Maria Kertbeny. By the turn of the century, it was in medical use, mostly in German and French. But it was not a word that ordinary people used to describe themselves. It was a clinical term, a diagnosis. To call yourself homosexual in 1905 was to claim a pathology. The men who came to Baden-Baden did not think of themselves that way. They used other language. Friends, companions, men of a certain temperament. In private letters, Some used the word Uranian, borrowed from the German legal reformer Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, who had argued in the 1860s that same-sex desire was an inborn variation, not a moral failing. Ulrichs had called men who loved men Urnings, after Plato's Urania, the muse of transcendent love. The term never caught on widely, but it circulated in educated circles. It was one way of naming the thing without sounding like a doctor. The sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who would later found the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, visited Baden-Baden several times in the 1900s. He was there to take the waters. Hirschfeld had chronic health problems, but he was also there to observe. In a 1908 essay, he wrote about spa towns as refuges for the third sex, places where the usual mechanisms of social surveillance broke down. He did not name Baden-Baden specifically, but he described a town that fit: wealthy, international, built around leisure, tolerant of eccentricity as long as it came with a bank account. Hirschfeld's framework, the idea of a third sex, a biological category distinct from male and female, was influential in early 20th century Germany. It gave men who loved men a way to think about themselves that was not purely negative. You were not sick, you were not immoral, you were simply different, a naturally occurring variation. That framework had limits. It still pathologized, it still framed same-sex desire as an abnormality, but it was better than what came before. And it was part of the intellectual atmosphere in which Baden-Baden's summer society existed. Some of the men who visited Baden-Baden were activists, or at least they were connected to the early gay rights movement that was beginning to coalesce in Berlin. In 1897, Hirschfeld had founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, the world's first organization dedicated to fighting anti-sodomy laws. The committee circulated petitions, published pamphlets, lobbied politicians. One of its strategies was to collect signatures from prominent men, doctors, lawyers, professors, artists, who supported the repeal of paragraph 175, the German law that criminalized sexual acts between men. The committee's membership lists have not survived intact, but fragments exist, and they include names that also appear in Baden-Baden's hotel registers: a professor of classical philology from Heidelberg, a theatre director from Munich, a retired military officer from Dresden. These were men who lived double lives, respectable professionals in their home cities, activists in the privacy of Hirschfeld's Berlin office, and simply themselves for a few weeks each summer in Baden-Baden. That was the function of the town. It was a pressure valve. It was a place where you could exhale, where you could stop performing the careful straight act that governed the rest of your year. You could walk beside another man and let your hand brush his. You could laugh too loudly at dinner. You could stay in the baths until your skin wrinkled and no one would ask why. And then, at the end of summer, you went home. Back to your wife, if you had one. Back to your job. Back to the performance. Until next year, when you would return to Baden-Baden and become, for a few weeks, the person you could not be anywhere else. It could not last. It was never going to last. The world that made Baden-Baden possible, the Belle Epoque world of easy borders, old money, and studied indifference, was already dying. The war would kill it outright. But even before 1914, the cracks were showing. In 1906, a scandal broke that sent tremors through every drawing room in Germany. It became known as the Eulenburg Affair, and it began when a journalist named Maximilian Harden published an article accusing Prince Philipp zu Eulenburg, one of Kaiser Wilhelm II's closest friends and advisors, of being part of what Harden called a homosexual cabal at the heart of the German government. Harden did not use gentle language. He accused Eulenburg and several other high-ranking officials of holding private gatherings where, as he put it, activities incompatible with their positions took place. The accusations were explosive. Eulenburg was not just any aristocrat. He was a prince. He had the Kaiser's ear. He had shaped German foreign policy for a decade. And now he was being publicly called a sodomite. Eulenburg denied everything. He sued Harden for libel. The case went to trial in 1907, and for months, German newspapers printed little else. Witnesses testified about private dinners, about letters written in affectionate language, about a weekend party at Eulenburg's estate where men had dressed in costumes and performed theatrical scenes from Greek mythology. The details were vague enough to be deniable, but specific enough to be damning. By the time the trial ended, with Harden acquitted and Eulenburg's reputation destroyed, the message was clear. The German state was no longer willing to look the other way. The historian Isabel Hull, in her work on sexuality and the German elite, called the Eulenburg affair a turning point in the policing of male intimacy. Before 1906, paragraph 175 had been enforced sporadically, mostly against working-class men caught in bathhouses or parks. After Eulenburg, no one was safe. The police began compiling lists of suspected homosexuals. Hotels were instructed to report guests whose behavior seemed suspicious. Bathhouses in Berlin came under renewed surveillance. The casual tolerance that had allowed men like Eulenburg to move through elite society unchallenged evaporated almost overnight. Baden-Baden felt the shift. In the summer of 1907, the number of visitors declined for the first time in a decade. The Friedrichsbad's records show a drop in season pass purchases. The Hotel Stephanie, which had been fully booked every June and July since the turn of the century, had vacancies. Some of the regular visitors simply stopped coming. Ernst Waldheim, the banker from Frankfurt, made one final trip to Baden-Baden in August 1907. His diary entry from that visit is brief. The town feels different, quieter. I do not think I will return. He never did. He died in 1911 in Frankfurt, apparently of a heart attack. The obituary in the Frankfurter Zeitung described him as a lifelong bachelor and devoted patron of the arts. There was no mention of Baden-Baden, no mention of the summers he had spent there, or the student from Berlin whose hands he had once found remarkable. But others did return. Count von Seckendorf, the flagrant one, kept coming. So did dozens of others whose names fill the hotel registers through 1908, 1909, 1910. The surveillance was increasing, but it had not yet reached Baden-Baden. The town's economy still depended on discretion. The local police still looked the other way. For a few more years, the summer city held. Here is what those years looked like, in finer detail. Imagine you are one of the men who returned to Baden-Baden in the summer of 1909, despite the changed atmosphere. You arrive by train on a Tuesday in June. The weather is warm but not yet oppressive. The porter who takes your bag recognizes you from last year. He nods. You walk to the Hotel Stephanie. At the front desk, the clerk hands you a key without asking questions. Your room is on the second floor, overlooking the gardens. It is the same room you stayed in last year and the year before that. You requested it specifically when you wrote to make your reservation. The room has pale green wallpaper, a brass bed frame, a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light. A door in the west wall connects to the adjoining room. The door is unlocked. You unpack, hang your suits in the wardrobe, arrange your books on the bedside table. You have brought 3 volumes this time. A collection of Platon's odes, a French novel that was banned in Prussia, and a medical text by Havelock Ellis that you keep wrapped in brown paper. Then you change into lighter clothes and walk downstairs. The Lichtentäler Alley is already crowded. It is 4 in the afternoon, the peak hour. You walk slowly, heading south toward the monastery. The roses are in full bloom. The scent is almost overwhelming. You pass other men walking in pairs, groups of women in summer dresses, a family with small children feeding ducks at the edge of the Ouse River. At the bench near the bridge, you pause. This is the bench. You have sat here every visit for the past 4 years. You do not sit now. Not yet. But you pause long enough to be noticed. You adjust your hat. You take out your pocket watch, check the time, put it away. These are the signals. 15 years later, when the semiotics of cruising would be codified and catalogued by researchers like Hirschfeld and George Chauncey, these gestures would be recognized as part of a shared language. But in 1909, they simply feel natural. You are announcing your presence. You are saying, I am here, I am looking. A man approaches. He is younger than you, perhaps 30. Dark hair, trim beard. Well-dressed, but not ostentatious. He carries a walking stick. He stops beside the bench, looks out at the river, and says something about the weather. You agree that it is pleasant. He asks if you are staying long. You say a fortnight, perhaps 3 weeks. He nods. He introduces himself. His name is Dieter Hartmann. He is from Stuttgart. You give your name. You are not using your real name. You learned years ago that in Baden-Baden, a degree of invention is permitted. You are travelling as Johann Becker, a civil servant from Cologne. It is close enough to the truth to be plausible. You are a civil servant, though not from Cologne, and distant enough to protect you if anything goes wrong. You and Dieter walk together, south along the alley, past the Trinkhalle with its long colonnade of frescoed arches, past the Rose Garden where an orchestra is setting up for the evening concert. You talk about inconsequential things, the quality of the water this year, the heat, the new hotel being built near the station. You are performing normalcy, 2 men taking a walk, nothing unusual. At the far end of the alley, where the path turns into a wooded trail leading up into the forest, Dieter stops. He asks if you have been to the Friedrichsbad yet. You say not yet, but you plan to go this evening. He says he is going as well. Perhaps you will see each other there. You part ways. He walks back toward town. You continue into the forest, just far enough to be alone, and then you sit on a fallen log and feel your heart rate return to normal. This is the dance. This is how it works. Every interaction calibrated. Every word chosen. You are never explicit. You never say the thing directly. But the meaning passes between you all the same. Tonight, at the Friedrichsbad, you will see Dieter again. And what happens there will determine whether this acquaintance becomes something more. The Friedrichsbad in the evening is a different world. The daytime crowds have thinned. The tourists who come for a quick plunge and a massage have gone back to their hotels to dress for dinner. What remains are the regulars, men who know the ritual, who understand that the 3-hour bathing sequence is not really about health. It is about time. It is about being in a space where the outside world cannot reach you. You begin in the warm air room, dry heat, marble benches, a ceiling painted with mythological scenes, Hercules bathing, Achilles being dipped in the Styx. You sit, you breathe. Other men drift in and out. Some you recognize from previous visits. A nod, a brief smile, no words. Then the steam room, hotter. The air is thick and white. You can barely see. Shapes move in the mist. You find a place to sit. The heat is almost unbearable at first, but you adjust. Your skin prickles. Sweat runs down your back. Somewhere in the steam, you hear voices. Low, laughing quietly at something. Dieter appears. You did not see him enter, but now he is there, sitting a few feet away. He does not speak, neither do you, but he is there. The message is received. After the steam, the hot pool. This is the center of the ritual, a circular pool of mineral water, big enough for a dozen men. The temperature is just below scalding. You lower yourself in slowly. The shock of heat makes you gasp. Then your body acclimates, and the heat becomes almost pleasant. Muscle deep, bone deep. Dieter is in the pool. So are 4 other men. You position yourself across from him. The pool is dim. The only light comes from small windows set high in the walls. But you can see his face. He is looking at you. You hold the gaze. 1 second. 2. Then you look away. No one speaks. The only sound is water lapping against tile. This silence is part of the ritual too. It is intimate without being intrusive. You are sharing a space, sharing heat, sharing the vulnerability of nakedness. but you are not acknowledging it. Not yet. After 20 minutes, the cold plunge. A small pool of water so cold it feels like knives. You submerge. Gasp. Surface. Your heart is pounding. The shock of it makes you feel intensely alive. Dieter is beside you now, close enough that your arms brush. He says something quiet. You do not catch the words, but the tone is clear. An invitation. The final stage is the restroom. A long chamber lined with heated marble slabs. You lie down. An attendant covers you with warm towels. The heat from the stone seeps into your back. You close your eyes. You are drifting. Half asleep. The attendant leaves. When you open your eyes again, Dieter is on the slab beside yours. He is looking at the ceiling. His hand rests near the edge of the marble, close to yours. Not touching, but close. You move your hand. 1 inch. 2. Your fingers brush his. He does not pull away. That is the moment. That is the threshold. Everything before this has been deniable. A walk, a conversation, men bathing together. What could be more innocent? But this touch, in this silence, is unambiguous. It is a declaration. You lie there, fingers touching, no one else in the room. The heat and the exhaustion and the years of careful performance all dissolving into this single point of contact. Eventually, you both rise, dress, walk out into the cool night air. The town is lit with gas lamps. The casino is glowing. Music drifts from the Kurhaus. You walk together back toward the Hotel Stephanie. At the entrance, Dieter asks if you would like to join him for a drink. You say yes. The hotel bar is nearly empty. You sit in a corner booth, order brandy, talk about nothing important, where you are from, what you do. The conversation is still cautious, still coded, but the touch in the baths has changed the terms. You both know what this is. At 11, Dieter says he should retire. You agree. You walk upstairs together. His room, it turns out, is on the same floor as yours. 3 doors down. He pauses at his door, looks at you, says goodnight, goes inside. You stand in the hallway. The door to the adjoining room, your room and the room next to yours, is still unlocked. You know this because you unlocked it yourself this afternoon. You walk to your room, open the door, stand there for a moment, listening. Then you hear a soft knock. From the connecting door, you open it. Dieter is standing there. He does not say anything, he just steps through. This is what the historical record cannot show you. The letters that survive are careful. The diaries are vague. The official documents record only arrivals and departures, meals charged to room accounts, payments made at the front desk. But this, the knock on the connecting door, the man stepping through, the moment when the pretense finally falls away, this happened. It happened in dozens of rooms in Baden-Baden every summer. It happened quietly. It happened without record. But it happened. You and Dieter are not unique. You are part of a pattern that the town enabled and protected, as long as you followed the rules, as long as you were discreet, as long as you paid your bill and did not disturb the neighbors. The next morning, you wake alone. Dieter has returned to his room before dawn. At breakfast, you see him in the dining room. He nods. You nod back. No one watching would see anything unusual. 2 hotel guests acknowledging each other in passing. But over the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeats. Walks in the afternoon, the baths in the evening, drinks at the bar, the knock on the connecting door. You learn things about Dieter. He is a lawyer. He has a wife and 2 children in Stuttgart. He comes to Baden-Baden every summer, always alone, always for exactly 3 weeks. This is his other life. The life he cannot live anywhere else. You understand? You have a similar arrangement. You are not married, but you have a position, responsibilities, a reputation to maintain. For 50 weeks a year, you are Johann Becker, respectable civil servant. For 2 weeks in Baden-Baden, you are simply Johann, the man who walks beside Dieter Hartmann, the man who touches his hand in the baths, the man who opens the connecting door when the knock comes. It is a temporary thing. You both know it. At the end of 3 weeks, you will both leave. Return to your separate lives. You will probably not correspond. That would be too risky. But next summer, you will both return. And you will find each other again. That is the unspoken agreement. That is how the summer city works. The historian Robert Beechey, in his research on gay Berlin, found evidence that this pattern, the summer affair, the annual return to the same place, the careful separation of lives, was widespread among middle-class and upper-class gay men in early 20th century Germany. He called it temporal compartmentalization. You were not living a double life simultaneously, you were living two lives sequentially, and the geographic separation between them provided a buffer. Baden-Baden was not the only town where this happened. There were others. But Baden-Baden, with its infrastructure of discretion and its economy built on secrets, was among the most successful. Some relationships lasted years this way. The hotel registers show men returning to the same hotels, in the same months, for a decade or more. Some of those men were traveling alone. Some were traveling with the same companion year after year. The registers do not record the nature of the relationship, but the pattern is there. And then, in 1914, the pattern broke. The war came, and the summer city disappeared overnight. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, happened at the beginning of Baden-Baden's high season. The town was full. Hotels were booked. The Kurhaus was hosting nightly concerts. And then, within a month, Europe was at war. Germany mobilized. Borders closed. Travel became difficult, then dangerous, then impossible. Baden-Baden emptied. By August, the grand hotels had closed their upper floors. The Friedrichsbad reduced its hours. The casino stayed open. Gambling does not stop for war, but the clientele changed. Instead of international visitors, it was local residents and military officers on leave. The men who had come every summer did not come. They could not. Dieter Hartmann, the lawyer from Stuttgart, was called up. He served as a military legal officer, assigned to a supply depot in Bavaria. He survived the war, but he never returned to Baden-Baden. We know this because his name does not appear in the hotel registers after 1914. Ernst Waldheim was already dead by then. Count von Seckendorf enlisted in 1914, despite being over 40. He was killed in France in 1915. The obituary in the Munich papers described him as a patriot and a hero. It made no mention of the parties he had thrown, or the secretaries he had travelled with, or the summers in Baden-Baden. The war killed 9 million men. It redrew the map of Europe. It ended empires. And among the smaller, quieter casualties was the world that had made Baden-Baden possible. The world of easy money and easy travel. The world where a man could take 3 weeks every summer to visit a spa town, and no one asked too many questions about why he went alone. After the war, things were different. Germany was broken. The economy was shattered. Inflation made the mark nearly worthless. The grand hotels struggled. Some closed permanently. The Friedrichsbad stayed open, but it was no longer the luxurious retreat it had been. The marble cracked. The mosaics faded. There was no money for repairs, and the men who had once filled the town every summer, the bankers, the lawyers, the professors, the minor aristocrats, were gone. Some had died in the war. Some had lost their fortunes. Some had simply aged out of the rituals of cruising and bathing and connecting doors. The generation that had invented the summer city was disappearing. But something else was happening, something new. In the 1920s, Berlin became the gay capital of Europe. The city exploded with nightlife, cabarets, dance halls, bars that catered openly to gay men and lesbians, magazines, activist organizations, a whole visible, vibrant, defiant gay culture that did not bother with the careful discretion that had governed Baden-Baden. The sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who had visited Baden-Baden before the war, now ran the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. The institute had a library of 20,000 books on sexuality. It offered medical consultations. It conducted research. It was raided periodically by the police, but it kept operating. Hirschfeld himself became a public figure, lecturing across Germany, advocating for the repeal of paragraph 175. For a new generation of gay men, Baden-Baden seemed quaint, old-fashioned. Why spend 2 weeks walking carefully around a spa town when you could go to Berlin and dance openly at the El Dorado, one of the most famous gay clubs in the world? Why settle for a knock on a connecting door when you could find a lover who would actually live with you? Baden-Baden's role changed. It did not disappear, but it became less central. In the 1920s, the town still attracted visitors, but they were older now, men in their 50s and 60s who remembered the world before the war. who preferred the old rituals, the baths, the quiet walks, the discretion. One of those men was a retired officer named Gerhard Lessing. He had been coming to Baden-Baden since 1902. He kept coming through the 1920s, even as the town emptied and the hotels decayed. In a letter written in 1928 to a friend in Munich, Lessing described Baden-Baden as a museum of a lost world. He wrote, "The young men do not come anymore. They prefer Berlin, where they can be loud. I understand the appeal. But I'm too old to be loud. I come to Baden-Baden because it remembers what we were." Lessing was not wrong. The town did remember. The architecture remembered, the Lichtenthaler Allee, the Friedrichsbad, the hotels with their connecting doors, all of it was still there. But the world that had animated those spaces was fading. And then the Nazis came to power, and the whole fragile structure collapsed. The transformation did not happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one tightening the noose a little more. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. By March, the Reichstag had passed the Enabling Act, giving Hitler dictatorial powers. By May, the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin was destroyed. That destruction was not accidental. It was not a side effect of larger political changes. It was deliberate. On May 6, 1933, a group of Nazi students stormed Hirschfeld's institute. They smashed the windows. They dragged 12,000 books and 35,000 photographs out into the street. They piled them in the Opernplatz and set them on fire. Newsreel cameras recorded the whole thing. Joseph Goebbels gave a speech as the flames rose, declaring that the era of Jewish intellectualism was over. Hirschfeld was in France when it happened. He never returned to Germany. He spent the last 2 years of his life in exile, moving between Paris and Nice, watching from a distance as everything he had built was erased. He died in 1935, on his 67th birthday, in a hotel room overlooking the Mediterranean. The man who had documented and defended gay love for 4 decades died alone, in exile, having seen his life's work reduced to ash. The burning of the institute was a message. It was the Nazi regime announcing that there would be no tolerance, no negotiation, no space for queer existence under the new order. Paragraph 175, which had been enforced sporadically under the Weimar Republic, was now enforced ruthlessly. The law was amended in 1935 to expand its scope. Now it was not just sexual acts that were criminal. It was gestures. It was eye contact. It was writing a letter that could be interpreted as expressing desire. The police began compiling lists. If you had been arrested under paragraph 175 before, your name was on the list. If you had been a member of a gay rights organization, your name was on the list. If you had been seen at a known gay bar or bathhouse, your name was on the list. The lists grew. By 1936, there were an estimated 100,000 names in the central registry maintained by the Gestapo. Baden-Baden felt the change. In the summer of 1933, the town was quieter than it had been in decades. The international visitors who had once filled the hotels stayed away. The spa industry, already weakened by the Depression, contracted further. Some hotels closed. Others were repurposed. The Hotel Stephanie, which had been a refuge for men like Johann Becker and Dieter Hartmann, was sold to a developer in 1934. It was torn down. A bank was built on the site. The Friedrichsbad stayed open, but it was no longer a place where men lingered in the steam rooms. The staff had been given instructions. Watch for inappropriate behavior. Report anything suspicious. The intimacy that had once been possible in those marble halls evaporated. Men bathed quickly, kept their eyes down, left. The Lichtenthaler Allee was still there, still lined with linden trees and roses. But the benches were empty. The cruising rituals that had once played out along those gravel paths disappeared. It was too dangerous. Being seen talking to another man for too long, standing too close, making eye contact. Any of it could get you arrested. And arrest under the Nazis did not mean a fine or a slap on the wrist. It meant imprisonment. It meant a concentration camp. Gerhard Lessing, the retired officer who had written about Baden-Baden as a museum of a lost world, stopped coming in 1933. His letters to friends, preserved in a private archive in Stuttgart, show his growing fear. In August 1933, he wrote, "I no longer feel safe anywhere. The town that was once a refuge is now as dangerous as anywhere else, perhaps more so because it holds so many memories. I will not return." He was arrested in 1936 in Munich, where he had been living in retirement. The charge was violating paragraph 175. The evidence was a letter he had written to a friend expressing affection in language the Gestapo deemed incriminating. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison. He served his time in a prison near Nuremberg. When he was released in 1938, he was a broken man. He died later that year, officially of pneumonia, though his medical records suggest he had been beaten severely while in custody. Lessing was one of thousands. The historian Rüdiger Lautmann, working in the 1970s and 1980s with camp records and survivor testimonies, estimated that between 5,000 and 15,000 gay men were sent to concentration camps during the Nazi era. The actual number is probably higher, because many arrests under paragraph 175 resulted in prison sentences rather than camp internment, and those records were often destroyed or lost. The men who were sent to camps wore a pink triangle sewn onto their uniforms. The triangle marked them as homosexuals. It placed them at the bottom of the camp hierarchy. Even among prisoners, they were despised. The Nazis categorized them as asocials, people whose existence was incompatible with the health of the German nation. They were worked to death in quarries and factories. They were subjected to medical experiments. They were castrated. They died at higher rates than almost any other category of prisoner, except Jews and Soviet POWs. And when the camps were liberated in 1945, the gay prisoners were not freed. Paragraph 175 was still on the books. Allied authorities, uncertain what to do with men convicted under German law, often left them in prison or transferred them to civilian jails to complete their sentences. Some men who survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald spent years in post-war prisons for the crime of being gay. This is what happened to the world that Baden-Baden had sheltered. The connecting doors were torn down. The careful rituals were criminalized. The men who had walked the Lichtenthaler Alley arm in arm were hunted, imprisoned, killed. But let's go back. Let's go back to the moment when it started to fall apart, because the story of how it ended matters. But so does the story of how the men who lived through it tried to hold on. In the summer of 1932, 1 year before Hitler came to power, Baden-Baden had a brief resurgence. The economy was stabilizing slightly after the worst years of the Depression. The hotels reopened some of their closed floors. The Friedrichsbad ran a promotional campaign advertising its therapeutic benefits. And for one last summer, the men came back, not in the numbers they had before the war, but enough that the town felt alive again. Enough that if you walked the Lichtenthaler Allee on a June evening in 1932, you could almost believe that the old world still existed. One of the men who came that summer was a writer named Ernst Toller. Toller was famous, or infamous, depending on who you asked. He had been a playwright and a revolutionary, a leader of the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic in 1919. When the Republic was crushed, he had been sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served his time writing plays that were performed across Germany and translated into a dozen languages. By 1932, he was out of prison, living in Berlin, and watching with growing alarm as the Nazi Party gained seats in the Reichstag. Toller was not gay, as far as the historical record shows, but he was part of the intellectual and artistic circles that overlapped heavily with Berlin's gay world. He knew Hirschfeld. He had friends who were openly queer. And he came to Baden-Baden in 1932 because he needed to rest, to think, to figure out what to do as Germany slid toward catastrophe. He stayed at the Hotel Messmer, the same hotel where Count von Seckendorf had thrown his parties 2 decades earlier. In his memoir, I Was a German, written in exile in 1933, Toller described Baden-Baden as a town haunted by its own past. He wrote about walking the allée and seeing men who looked like ghosts. Old men, mostly, sitting on benches, staring at nothing. He did not understand at first what he was seeing. Then a friend explained. These were the men who had come to Baden-Baden for years, for decades. They were still coming, even though the world that had made their visits meaningful was gone. Toller met one of those men. His name was Albrecht Weiss. He was 71 years old. He had been coming to Baden-Baden every summer since 1898. 34 years of visits. He told Toller that he kept coming because he did not know what else to do. His life was organized around this rhythm. Winter in Hamburg, where he lived alone in a small apartment. Summer in Baden-Baden, where he walked the same paths, visited the same bathhouse, sat on the same benches. He had outlived almost everyone he had known in the town, but he kept coming. Weiss told Toller about the early days, about the crowded baths and the late-night gatherings and the sense of possibility. He said it felt like a different country, not just a different time, but a different place entirely. A place where the rules were suspended, where men could be gentle with each other, where love did not have to hide. Toller asked him what he would do if the Nazis came to power. Weiss shrugged. He said he was too old to run, too old to fight. He would keep coming to Baden-Baden until they arrested him or he died, whichever came first. Toller left Baden-Baden in July 1932. He returned to Berlin. The next year, when the Reichstag burned and the arrests began, he fled to Switzerland, then France, then England, then the United States. He spent the rest of the 1930s in exile, writing, lecturing, trying to warn the world about what was happening in Germany. In 1939, depressed and exhausted, he hanged himself in a New York hotel room. He was 45. Albrecht Weiss did not flee. He returned to Baden-Baden in the summer of 1933, even as the town emptied. He was arrested in August while walking the Lichtenthaler Allee. The charge was loitering with intent to solicit. There was no evidence. There did not need to be evidence. He was 72 years old. He had been walking the same path for 35 years. That was evidence enough. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison. He died there in November 1933, officially of heart failure. The prison records note that he had been in solitary confinement for the final 3 weeks of his life. They do not say why. His death was not reported in any newspaper. There was no obituary. He had no family that the records show. He simply disappeared. The only reason we know anything about him at all is because Ernst Toller wrote about meeting him, and because a researcher named Klaus Müller, working in the 1990s on a project documenting Nazi persecution of gay men, found Weiss's name in a prison ledger in Karlsruhe and connected it to Toller's memoir. Weiss is one name, one man, but he represents thousands of others whose names we do not know. Men who had spent years, decades, building lives in the margins, who had found places like Baden-Baden where they could breathe, who watched those places disappear, who were arrested, imprisoned, erased. The summer of 1933 was the last time Baden-Baden functioned, even partially, as a refuge. By 1934, the surveillance was too intense, the risks were too high. The men stopped coming. The hotels that had once hosted them pivoted to other clientele or closed. The bathhouses remained open, but they were scrubbed of any trace of the intimacy that had once made them meaningful. The town itself changed in other ways too. The Nazi regime, obsessed with physical fitness and racial purity, promoted spa culture as part of its broader project of creating a healthy German body. Baden-Baden was rebranded as a centre for therapeutic healing, not leisure. The focus shifted from relaxation to regimentation. The baths were no longer places to linger, they were places to be treated, to be improved, to be made fit for the purposes of the state. In 1936, the town hosted a subsidiary event for the Berlin Olympics. Athletes came to Baden-Baden to recover from their exertions. The Friedrichsbad was photographed for propaganda purposes, showing strong Aryan men in disciplined rows, benefiting from the healing waters of the fatherland. The photos were distributed internationally as evidence of German vigour and modernity. There is a deep irony here, and it is worth pausing on. The same baths that had once been a refuge for gay men were now being used to promote a regime that was systematically murdering them. The same town that had offered discretion and safety was now complicit in the machinery of persecution. The discretion that had once protected men like Ernst Waldheim and Dieter Hartmann was now being deployed to hide what was happening to men like Albrecht Weiss. Baden-Baden's silence, which had once been a kindness, became a weapon. The town did not resist the Nazi regime. Most German towns did not. But Baden-Baden's particular history makes its collaboration especially painful. This was a place that had known how to look the other way, that had built an entire economy on not asking questions. And when the questions became a matter of life and death, the town continued not asking them. There were exceptions, small acts of resistance, or at least refusal. The historian Jürgen Sander, working in the Baden-Baden city archives in the 1980s, found records of a hotel manager named Rosa Zimmermann, who was questioned by the Gestapo in 1935 about whether she had knowingly rented rooms to homosexuals. She denied it. The Gestapo did not believe her. They searched her hotel records, found the names of men who had stayed there repeatedly, and cross-referenced them with their central registry. 3 of the men were arrested based on information from her hotel ledgers. Zimmermann was not arrested herself, but her hotel was put under surveillance. She sold it in 1936 and left Baden-Baden. In a letter to a friend, preserved in a private collection, she wrote, "I cannot live in a town that has become a trap." That phrase, a trap, captures something essential about what happened to Baden-Baden. The infrastructure of discretion that had once protected people was turned against them. The hotel registers that had recorded carefully invented names were now evidence. The bathhouses that had offered privacy were now sites of surveillance. The town that had sheltered secrets was now a place where secrets could get you killed. And yet, even as late as 1938, there were still men who tried to visit. The hotel records from those years are sparse. Many were destroyed during the war, but fragments survive. In June 1938, a man checked into a small guest house near the Kurhaus. He gave his name as Franz Müller. He stayed for 3 days. He visited the Friedrichsbad once. He walked the Lichtenthaler Allee. And then he left. We do not know who he was. Franz Müller is almost certainly not his real name. It is the German equivalent of John Smith. But he was there. One more man, trying to reclaim something that no longer existed, trying to walk the paths that had once meant freedom, trying to feel, for 3 days, like the world had not ended. By 1939, even that was impossible. The war began in September. Travel restrictions tightened. The hotels closed. The baths reduced their hours again, then closed entirely. Baden-Baden, like every other town in Germany, turned its attention to the war effort. The summer city, already dead, was buried. The war brought its own devastations to Baden-Baden. The town was bombed, though not as heavily as industrial centres like Hamburg or Dresden. The Kurhaus was damaged, several hotels were destroyed, the Friedrichsbad survived, but it was not maintained. By 1945, when American forces occupied the town, the bathhouse was in disrepair. The marble was cracked. The mosaics were filthy. The heating system had broken down, and the pools were empty. The Americans turned Baden-Baden into a headquarters and recreation center for their troops. The grand hotels that survived the war were requisitioned. Officers stayed in the rooms where men like Ernst Waldheim had once spent their summers. The Lichtenthaler Allee became a place for American soldiers to walk with German women they were dating, or planning to marry, or just trying to impress. The town's gay history was not mentioned. It was not remembered. The men who had once filled the hotels were dead, or scattered, or silent. The few who survived did not talk about it. What would be the point? The world they had known was gone. The discretion that had once protected them now meant there was no record, no memorial, no acknowledgement that they had ever existed. It would be decades before historians started piecing the story together. In the 1970s and 1980s, researchers like Rüdiger Lautmann and Klaus Müller began interviewing survivors of the Nazi persecution, combing through archives, reconstructing what had been lost. They found scraps, fragments, letters, diary entries, hotel registers, prison records. From those scraps, they built a picture of the gay worlds that had existed in Germany before the Third Reich destroyed them. Baden-Baden was part of that picture. Not the most important part, Berlin was the center, the magnet, the city that everyone wrote about. But Baden-Baden mattered because it showed a different model. Not visibility, but invisibility. Not defiance, but discretion. Not a public gay culture, but a private one. And for the men who needed that privacy, who could not risk the openness of Berlin, Baden-Baden had been essential. The town today does not acknowledge this history. There are no plaques, no memorials. The Friedrichsbad has been beautifully restored, returned to its original 19th century glory. You can still bathe there, still follow the same 3-hour ritual that men like Ernst Waldheim followed in 1902. The marble gleams, the mosaics have been reset, the pools are kept at precisely the correct temperatures. But if you go there, no one will tell you that this was once a place where gay men found each other. No one will mention the summers when the bathhouse hummed with a particular kind of energy. No one will say the names of the men who walked these halls, who touched hands in the steam, who built fragile temporary lives in the spaces between the official world and their own desires. The Lichtenthaler Allee is still there, still beautiful. The roses still bloom every June. Tourists still walk the gravel paths, still sit on the benches, still feed the ducks in the Ouse River. But the benches are not marked. There is no sign that says, here, in 1905, men waited for other men. Here, they made eye contact. Here, they found each other. The Hotel Stephanie is gone, replaced by a bank. The Hotel Mesmer still exists, renovated and expensive, catering to wealthy tourists and business travelers. The connecting doors between rooms are gone. Modern hotel design does not include them. The idea that guests might need discreet access to each other's rooms is no longer part of the architectural vocabulary. History has a way of forgetting what it does not want to remember. And for a long time, no one wanted to remember the gay men of Baden-Baden. They were too inconvenient, too embarrassing, too complicated. They did not fit the narratives that post-war Germany wanted to tell about itself. The story of resistance to the Nazis was easier to tell than the story of collaboration. The story of victims was easier than the story of people who had tried to survive by staying invisible. But the men were there. They existed. They loved. They built a world, fragile and temporary as it was. And that world mattered. It mattered because it showed what was possible. Even in a country that criminalized their existence, even under a law that could send them to prison for a kiss, these men found a way to live. Not openly, not defiantly, but genuinely. They created space for themselves in a world that wanted them erased. And the fact that the space was temporary, that it existed only in summer, that it required careful performance and constant vigilance, none of that made it less real. There is a letter in the Hamburg State Archive, dated July 1911. written by a man who signed himself only as E.W. The handwriting matches Ernst Waldheim's signature on other documents. The letter was addressed to a friend, also unnamed. In it, Waldheim described an evening in Baden-Baden. He wrote about walking the Lichtenthaler Allee at sunset. He described the colour of the light through the trees. He wrote about sitting on a bench and watching two men walk past, arm in arm, laughing at something. He wrote, "I realised I was happy, genuinely happy, not the performance of happiness, not the careful approximation of contentment, but the real thing. I cannot remember the last time I felt that way. And I thought, this is what life could be, if the world were different, if we were allowed." The letter breaks off there. There is no closing, no signature beyond the initials. It was found folded inside a book, Platon's Collected Odes, which was donated to the archive in the 1960s by someone who did not know its significance. A librarian cataloguing the donation noticed the letter, recognized that it might be historically important, and preserved it. That librarian probably saved the only record of that evening, that moment of happiness, that brief glimpse of what life could be. Waldheim wrote that letter in 1911, 2 years before his death, 3 years before the world that had given him that happiness would begin to collapse. He did not know what was coming. None of them did. They thought Baden-Baden would always be there, that the rituals would continue, that every summer they could return and find each other again. The tragedy is not just that it ended. The tragedy is how thoroughly it was erased. The men who survived into the post-war era did not talk about it. The shame was too deep. The fear was too ingrained. Even after the war, even after the camps were liberated, paragraph 175 remained law in West Germany until 1969. And even after decriminalization, the social stigma persisted. Men who had lived through the 1930s and 1940s had learned to be silent. That silence became permanent. There is a recording from 1978, part of an oral history project conducted by researchers at the Free University of Berlin. The subject is identified only as Respondent 47. He was 83 years old at the time of the interview. He talked about his youth in the 1920s and 1930s. He mentioned, briefly, visiting Baden-Baden. The interviewer asked him to elaborate. There is a long pause on the recording. You can hear him breathing. Then he said, "I would rather not." The interviewer pressed gently. Another pause. Then, "Those memories belong to people who are dead. I do not think they would want me to speak for them." He never did elaborate. The interview moved on to other topics. But that reluctance, that sense that the memories belong to the dead and should stay with them, was common among survivors. They had spent their entire lives learning not to talk, not to name the thing, not to make themselves visible. And even when visibility became safer, even when researchers came to them with tape recorders and permissions and promises of anonymity, the habit of silence was too strong. So the history of Baden-Baden's gay summers survived mostly in fragments, in hotel registers that recorded names that were probably false, in diary entries that were carefully vague, in letters that broke off mid-thought, in the gaps between what was said and what was meant. But there is another kind of evidence, structural evidence, the evidence of the town itself. When you walk Baden-Baden today, you can still see the bones of the world that existed there. The Lichtenthaler Allee is still 2.5 kilometers of perfect cruising ground, wide enough for privacy, public enough for safety, beautiful enough to justify lingering. The benches are still placed at intervals that suggest they were meant for more than just resting. The paths still curve in ways that create small hidden moments, places where two people walking together might brush hands without being seen. The Friedrichsbad is still structured for intimacy. The progression through the rooms, warm air, steam, hot pool, cold plunge, rest, still creates a rhythm that strips away the social performance. You enter, clothed and formal. You move through heat and water. You emerge vulnerable and open. The architecture was designed for healing, but it also functioned as a kind of ritual space where ordinary social boundaries dissolved. The hotels that survive still have the same basic layout: high ceilings, long hallways, thick walls, the kind of design that afforded privacy in an era before modern soundproofing. Rooms positioned so that guests could come and go without being seen from the lobby. Servants' stairs that allowed discreet movement. None of this was accidental. Baden-Baden was purpose-built for secrets. The entire town was designed to accommodate the needs of people who could not afford to be seen doing what they came there to do. Gambling, yes. Affairs, yes. But also same-sex love. The town's infrastructure of discretion served all of those purposes equally. And it served them well for decades, until the political context changed so drastically that no amount of discretion could protect anyone. Let's talk about what happened to some of the specific places. The Friedrichsbad, as I mentioned, survived. It was damaged during the war, neglected for years afterward, then restored in the 1980s. Today, it is a tourist attraction. You can still bathe there. The restoration was meticulous, based on the original 1877 plans. The pools are the same size. The marble is the same type. Even the painted ceiling in the hot pool, showing mythological bathing scenes, was restored based on photographs from the early 1900s. But the culture of the place is completely different. Modern visitors move through quickly. They follow the prescribed routine, but they do not linger. The attendants keep things moving. There are schedules to maintain, hygiene standards to uphold. The 3-hour ritual that men like Waldheim experienced has been compressed to 90 minutes. You can still do the full sequence, but the pace is faster. There is less time for the intimacy that made the place meaningful, and the clientele has changed. The Friedrichsbad today is mostly tourists, couples, families, on the days when the baths are not gender segregated, health enthusiasts, people who have read about the historic bathhouse in a travel guide and want to see it. The men who might once have come to Baden-Baden for the same reasons Waldheim did now go elsewhere. To Berlin, where there are saunas and clubs that cater explicitly to gay men. To Amsterdam, to Barcelona, to places where they do not have to translate their desires into a language of health and tourism. The Lichtenthaler Allee is a public park, maintained beautifully. The roses are still planted and pruned. The gravel paths are raked, but it is not a cruising ground anymore. The culture that made cruising possible, the shared language of gestures, the tolerance for lingering, the understanding that a public park could also be a semi-private space, is gone. If two men walk the alley today holding hands, no one would arrest them. No one would even notice. But they also would not need to. They could hold hands anywhere. The alley is no longer necessary in the way it once was. The hotels have been renovated, sold, repurposed. The Hotel Stephanie, as I said, is gone. The Hotel Mesmer is expensive and impersonal. The Hotel Brenner, which was popular in the 1920s, is now a business conference centre. The small guest houses that used to line the side streets near the Kurhaus have mostly been converted to apartments. There is one exception, a small hotel called the Lohen on a quiet street behind the train station. It is family-owned. It has been operating continuously since 1903. The building has been updated, but the layout is original. And in the basement, there is a storage room where the old guest registers are kept. Stacks of leather-bound ledgers, one for each year, dating back to the hotel's opening. The current owner, a woman named Helga Kessler, inherited the hotel from her father in the 1990s. She told an interviewer in 2005 that she had read through some of the old registers out of curiosity. She noticed patterns, pairs of men, returning every summer. Men who listed addresses that did not exist when she checked city directories. Men whose handwriting appeared in multiple registers under different names. She said, "I think I understand what was happening. Or at least, I think I understand that something was happening that people needed to hide. I wish I could tell those men that it's safe now, that they could come back. But they are all dead, of course." Kessler has considered creating some kind of memorial or acknowledgement in the hotel. A small plaque, maybe. Something that says, "This was a place that sheltered people who needed shelter." But she has not done it yet. She is not sure how. She does not want to out anyone posthumously. The men who stayed at her hotel used false names for a reason. Even in death, she feels obliged to respect their privacy. This is the ethical tangle of recovering this history. The very discretion that allowed men to survive also makes it almost impossible to honor them. They hid their names, they hid their faces, they hid their loves. And now, a century later, we are left with traces but not identities, with patterns but not people. We can say, gay men came to Baden-Baden. We can say, they found each other here. We can say, the town sheltered them. But we cannot say most of their names. We cannot tell most of their specific stories. The privacy that protected them in life has rendered them anonymous in death. There are exceptions. Count von Seckendorf is a matter of public record because his status made him visible. Ernst Waldheim left a diary and letters, though even those are fragmentary. Albrecht Weiss is known because Ernst Toller wrote about him. But the hundreds or thousands of others, the lawyer from Stuttgart, the student from Berlin, the men who checked into the Hotel Stephanie under invented names, they are lost. Unless there is one other source, a surprising one: photograph collections. In the early 1900s, photography was becoming accessible to amateurs. Small cameras, like the Kodak Brownie, allowed ordinary people to take their own pictures. And people did. They photographed their travels, their vacations, their summers in places like Baden-Baden. Those photographs survive. They are scattered now, in family albums, in estate sales, in archives. Most are unlabeled. Most show exactly what you would expect. Tourists posing in front of the Kurhaus, groups of people at outdoor cafes, formal portraits in hotel lobbies. But some show more. The historian Jürgen Zander, who I mentioned earlier, collected hundreds of photographs from Baden-Baden's Belle Epoque period. He found them in flea markets, online auctions, small-town archives. He looked for patterns, and he found them. Photographs of two men standing close together, closer than friendship usually required. Photographs of men with their hands on each other's shoulders, their faces turned toward each other rather than the camera. Photographs of pairs of men who appeared together in multiple images across multiple years, suggesting they returned to Baden-Baden together repeatedly. None of these photographs are explicit. They would not have been. You could not take an explicit photograph and then have it developed at a commercial lab without risking arrest. But the photographs are suggestive. They show intimacy, affection, relationships that mattered enough to be documented, even if they had to be documented carefully. Zander published a collection of these photographs in 2001 in a book called Verborgene Leben, Hidden Lives. The book included about 60 images, along with Zander's analysis of what the photographs might reveal. He was careful. He used words like possibly and suggests and may indicate. He did not want to project modern categories onto historical relationships, but he also did not want to erase the possibility that some of these relationships were romantic, sexual, significant in ways that the historical record usually ignored. One photograph in particular stands out. It shows two men sitting on a bench. The location is clearly the Lichtenthaler Allee. You can see the distinctive iron railing and the linden trees in the background. The men are both in their 40s or 50s, well-dressed, formal in the way that early 1900s photographs required. But their posture is relaxed. One man has his arm along the back of the bench, not quite touching the other man's shoulders, but close. They are both looking at the camera, but they are also clearly aware of each other. There is an ease between them, a comfort. The photograph is dated, based on the clothing and the style of the print, to around 1908 or 1909. On the back, in faded ink, someone wrote, "BB, Juli, Baden-Baden, July." No names, no other context. Just two men on a bench, captured for a few seconds by a camera, preserved by accident for a century. Zander reproduced that photograph in his book. Below it, he wrote, "We do not know who these men were. We do not know if they were lovers, friends, or strangers who happened to sit together. But we know they were in Baden-Baden in July, sometime around 1908, and we know someone thought this moment was worth preserving. That is enough." Is it enough? I do not know. The historian in me wants names, dates, confirmation, the full story. But the human in me understands that sometimes the fragment is all you get. Sometimes the only way to honor a hidden life is to acknowledge that it was hidden, that it had to be hidden, that the hiding was not cowardice or shame, but survival. Let's return to the question of what gay men actually experienced in Baden-Baden, because the emotional texture of those experiences matters as much as the historical facts. Imagine you are one of the men in that photograph. You have come to Baden-Baden in July 1908. You have been coming for years. The town is familiar. You know which bench offers the best view of the river. You know which bathhouse attendant is discreet and which one asks too many questions. You know the rhythm of the days. But you also know that this world is fragile. You have read the newspapers. You know about the Eulenburg affair. You know that men like you are being arrested, disgraced, ruined. You know that what you are doing, sitting on this bench beside another man, allowing your knees to touch, looking at him in a way that means something, could destroy your life if it happened in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this is Baden-Baden. And in Baden-Baden, for now, it is still safe. The rules that govern the rest of your life do not apply here. You can sit on this bench. You can let your arm rest along the back, close to his shoulder. You can meet his eyes and smile. You can exist for these 2 weeks as the person you actually are, instead of the person you have to pretend to be. That feeling of temporary freedom, of brief authenticity, was what drew men to Baden-Baden year after year. It was not just about sex, though sex was certainly part of it. It was about the possibility of being seen, of being known, of having someone else understand the thing about you that you could never say out loud. The philosopher and novelist Klaus Mann, son of the famous writer Thomas Mann, wrote about this feeling in his own memoirs. Klaus was openly gay, or as openly as anyone could be in the 1920s. He travelled widely, knew everyone in Europe's artistic circles, and wrote extensively about gay life in Berlin, Paris, Amsterdam. But he also wrote about smaller towns, quieter places, where men found each other in the margins. In a 1932 essay, he wrote, "Berlin offers visibility, Amsterdam offers tolerance, but some men do not want visibility or even tolerance. They want invisibility with company. They want to disappear into a place where no one knows them, and then, within that anonymity, find one other person who knows them completely. That is what the spa towns offered. That is what places like Baden-Baden were for." Klaus Mann never mentioned Baden-Baden by name in that essay, but he knew. He had been there. His diaries, published posthumously, include a brief entry from August 1928. Spent 3 days in Baden-Baden, took the waters, met someone. His name does not matter. What matters is that for 3 days, I did not have to explain myself. That phrase, "I did not have to explain myself," captures something essential. In Berlin, Klaus could be openly gay, But he was always performing that openness. He was Klaus Mann, scandalous son of a famous father, gay writer, provocateur. In Baden-Baden, he could simply be a man taking a vacation. And within that ordinariness, he could find someone else, and they could understand each other without words. This is what the town offered. Not pride, not defiance, not revolution. Just the quiet relief of not having to explain, of being in a place where the people around you understood the codes, recognized the signals, and chose not to interfere. That culture of non-interference was Baden-Baden's greatest gift and eventually its greatest failing. The same discretion that protected gay men in 1905 allowed the town to collaborate with the Nazis in 1935 without ever having to publicly acknowledge what it was doing. The town looked the other way when men found each other. It also looked the other way when those same men were arrested. There is no evidence that any hotel in Baden-Baden refused to hand over its guest registers to the Gestapo. No evidence that any bathhouse attendant declined to answer questions about which men spent too long in the steam rooms. The town's economy had been built on discretion, and discretion cuts both ways. You do not ask questions when wealthy guests want privacy. You also do not ask questions when the Gestapo wants information. The only documented case of resistance comes from Rosa Zimmermann, the hotel manager I mentioned earlier, and her resistance was not active. She did not hide anyone. She did not destroy records. She simply sold her hotel and left town. That was the extent of what was possible, or at least the extent of what anyone was willing to risk. It is easy, from a century's distance, to judge, to wish that more people had resisted, to imagine that if the hotel managers and bathhouse attendants and town officials had simply refused to cooperate, the men could have been saved. But that is not how it worked. The Nazi regime did not need cooperation. It had the full force of the state. If one hotel refused to hand over its registers, the Gestapo would seize them. If one attendant refused to talk, they would arrest him and find someone who would. The infrastructure of discretion that had protected gay men for 30 years was turned into an infrastructure of surveillance overnight. And there was nothing the town could have done to stop it, short of open revolt, which did not happen in Baden-Baden, which did not happen in most of Germany. So we are left with a history that is mostly absence, absences in the archives, where letters were destroyed and diaries were burned, absences in the landscape, where buildings that once sheltered men have been demolished or repurposed, absences in the collective memory, where an entire dimension of Baden-Baden's past has been forgotten or deliberately ignored. But absences can still be read. Historians have learned to look for the empty spaces, the gaps in the record, the things that were too dangerous to write down. When you find a hotel register where two men checked in together repeatedly, using different names each time, that absence of consistent identity tells you something. When you find a bathhouse that reduced its hours in 1934 without explanation, that absence of explanation tells you something. When you find photographs where faces have been carefully cut out, leaving only bodies and backgrounds, that absence of faces tells you everything. There is a photograph collection at the Baden-Baden City Museum. It was donated in 1978 by the estate of a local photographer who had worked in the town from 1895 until his death in 1952. The collection contains thousands of images, most a straightforward documentation of town life, street scenes, buildings, public events. But there is one box, labelled simply Private Commissions, that contains about 40 photographs that are different. They are portraits mostly, well-dressed men, photographed in the photographer's studio or outdoors in carefully chosen locations. The photographs are beautifully composed, professional quality, but they are also strange because in more than half of them, a second figure has been removed. You can see the evidence, the way one man's arm is positioned, as if resting on someone's shoulder, but the shoulder is not there. The way two chairs are arranged facing each other, but only one is occupied. The way the lighting suggests two people were present, but the photograph shows only one. Someone, at some point, went through these photographs and carefully removed the second person, used scissors or a knife to cut the figure out. In some cases, the entire photograph was trimmed down, removing a third or half of the original image. In others, the cut is more surgical, removing just the face or body while leaving the background intact. The museum curator who catalogued the collection in the 1980s noted this in her records. She wrote, "It appears these were originally double portraits that were later altered, presumably to protect the identity of one or both subjects. The alterations were done carefully, suggesting they were not acts of anger or rejection, but rather acts of protection or concealment." That curator, whose name was Ingrid Hartmann, became curious. She started looking through the photographer's business ledgers, which had also been donated with the collection. She found entries for portrait commissions that matched the dates of the altered photographs. The ledgers listed the names of the clients, or at least the names they gave. She cross-referenced those names with city directories, hotel registers, and other records. Most of the names did not exist in any other document. They were invented. Hartmann published a short article about her findings in a local history journal in 1987. She argued that the photographer had been providing a specific service to a specific clientele, men who wanted portraits of themselves with their companions, but who also needed plausible deniability. The photographer would take the portrait, develop 2 prints, give one to each man, and if circumstances changed, if the relationship ended, or if one of the men got married, or if the political situation made it dangerous to possess such a photograph, the print could be altered. The second figure could be removed, and what remained was simply a portrait of a well-dressed man on vacation. Hartmann tried to interview the photographer's family to confirm her theory, but they declined to speak with her. The photographer's daughter, who was in her 80s by then, told Hartmann, "My father did many things in his career. I do not think it benefits anyone to speculate about his clients." That phrase, "it does not benefit anyone," is telling. Even in 1987, 50 years after the events in question, the instinct to protect, to conceal, to avoid naming the thing directly, that instinct was still there. But let's think about what those altered photographs represent. They represent men who wanted evidence that the relationship had existed, who wanted to be able to look at a photograph and remember, who cared enough to commission a portrait, which in the early 1900s was not a casual expense. A professional portrait session could cost the equivalent of a week's wages for a working-class man. For a middle-class professional, it was still a significant outlay. These men spent that money. They sat for the portraits. They posed together, carefully arranged by the photographer to look respectable, but also intimate. And then they took the photographs home, hid them, looked at them in private. And when it became too dangerous to keep them, they altered them rather than destroying them entirely. Because even a photograph with half the image cut away was better than nothing. It was still proof that the moment had happened, that the person had been there, that it had been real. This is the emotional core of Baden-Baden's gay history. It was real. The relationships were real. The feelings were real. The community, however temporary and fragile, was real. And the men who built it knew it was real, even if they also knew they could never fully acknowledge it. Let's talk about one more man. His name was Martin Goldschmidt. He was a Jewish doctor from Mannheim who came to Baden-Baden regularly in the 1920s. Goldschmidt specialized in internal medicine. He was well regarded professionally. He had a small practice, a modest apartment, and no family. He never married. He came to Baden-Baden every June and stayed for 2 weeks. Goldschmidt left behind a set of diaries, which are now held at the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. The diaries cover the period from 1919 to 1938. They are not explicitly about his sexuality. Goldschmidt was far too cautious for that, but they contain enough detail to reconstruct a picture of his life. In June 1924, he wrote, "Arrived in Baden-Baden this afternoon. The train was delayed, but the weather is fine. Checked into the usual hotel. Walked the allée before dinner. Saw H again. We spoke briefly. He looks well. I am glad he is here." H appears repeatedly in the diaries over the next several years, always in Baden-Baden. always in June. The entries are brief, but consistent. Dined with H. Walked with H to the monastery. H and I visited the Friedrichsbad. The tone is careful, neutral, but underneath the neutrality is something else. A rhythm, an anticipation. The entries leading up to each June trip show Goldschmidt counting down the days. The entries after each trip show him reflecting on the time spent. In June 1928, he wrote, "My 2 weeks with H have become the center of my year. Everything else is simply the time between." By 1932, the tone of the diaries had changed. Goldschmidt was writing about politics now, about the rise of the Nazi Party, about patients who stopped coming to his practice because he was Jewish, about colleagues who no longer acknowledged him in public. In May 1932, he wrote, "I do not know if it is safe to go to Baden-Baden this year, but I do not know if I can bear not to go." He went. The diary entry from June 1932 is longer than usual. He described the town as emptier, quieter. He wrote, "H is not here. I waited 3 days, but he did not come. I do not know if he is ill, or if he has decided it is too dangerous, or if he has simply stopped coming. I walked the alley alone, sat on our bench, felt foolish, left the next morning." That was Goldschmidt's last trip to Baden-Baden. In 1933, after Hitler came to power, he wrote, "I will not be going to Baden-Baden this year. I am not welcome in Germany anymore. None of us are." Goldschmidt emigrated to France in 1934. He worked in a clinic in Paris, treating refugees. When the Germans occupied France in 1940, he went into hiding. He was arrested in 1942 and deported to Auschwitz. He died there in October 1942 at the age of 56. His diaries were saved by a French colleague who had hidden them during the war. After the liberation, the colleague attempted to trace Goldschmidt's family to return the diaries. There was no family. Goldschmidt had been the last of his line. The colleague eventually donated the diaries to the Leo Baeck Institute, which was collecting documents related to German Jewish history. The diaries sat in the archive for decades. They were catalogued, preserved, but not widely read. They seemed unremarkable. A doctor's daily life, professional notes, mundane details. It was not until 1995, when a researcher named Ruth Levinson was working on a project about Jewish physicians in the Weimar Republic, that anyone noticed the pattern of the June trips. The repeated references to H, the careful language that suggested something more than friendship. Levinson wrote about Goldschmidt in a 2003 essay. She argued that he was almost certainly gay, and that his annual trips to Baden-Baden were his only opportunity to live as his authentic self. She wrote, "For 2 weeks each year, Martin Goldschmidt stopped being a Jewish doctor navigating the increasingly hostile world of 1920s Germany and became simply a man meeting another man. That those 2 weeks mattered more to him than the other 50 weeks of the year is clear from the diaries. That he was willing to risk the trip even in 1932, when it was manifestly unsafe, shows how desperately he needed them." We do not know who H was. Goldschmidt never gave the full name. Levinson searched for clues, but found nothing. H remains anonymous. We do not know what happened to him, whether he survived the war, whether he died in a camp like Goldschmidt, whether he simply grew old and died of natural causes, never knowing that the man he met in Baden-Baden every June had written about him with such quiet devotion. What we do know is that for a decade, Goldschmidt's life had a center, a place he returned to, a person he waited for. And that center was Baden-Baden. The town gave him that. And then, like everything else the town had given to men like him, it was taken away. The intersection of being gay and being Jewish under the Nazi regime is a particular kind of double jeopardy that historians have only recently begun to fully document. Men like Goldschmidt faced persecution on 2 fronts. They were arrested under paragraph 175 and also subject to the Nuremberg laws. In the camps, gay Jewish prisoners were at the very bottom of the hierarchy. They were despised by the SS guards, by the kapos, even by other prisoners. The scholar Geoffrey Giles, in his work on homosexuals in Nazi Germany, found evidence that gay Jewish men in camps were subjected to especially brutal treatment. They were given the hardest labor assignments. They were denied medical care. They were used for medical experiments. And they died at rates higher than almost any other category of prisoner. Goldschmidt's diary does not record his arrest or deportation. The last entry is from June 1942, written in Paris, while he was in hiding. It reads, "It has been 10 years since I saw H. I think of him often. I wonder if he thinks of me. I wonder if he is still alive. I wonder if he remembers our bench, our walks, our 2 weeks. I hope he does. I hope someone remembers." That entry was written a few weeks before Goldschmidt was arrested. It is the last thing he wrote. The diary ends there. Ruth Levinson, the researcher who found and wrote about Goldschmidt's diaries, tried to trace H. She looked through Baden-Baden hotel registers from the 1920s. She found several men whose names began with H, who stayed at hotels during the same weeks Goldschmidt was there. But without knowing more, she could not identify which one, if any, was the right person. She considered publishing the full diaries, hoping someone might recognize a detail and come forward, but she ultimately decided against it. She wrote, "Goldschmidt protected H's identity in life. I do not feel I have the right to expose it in death. Whoever H was, he mattered to Martin Goldschmidt. That is enough. Is it enough? Again, I do not know. Part of me wants the full story, wants to know who H was, whether they loved each other, whether H mourned Goldschmidt's death, or even knew about it, whether H himself survived, and if so, how he lived with the memory of those 2 weeks every June. But the other part of me understands that sometimes the gaps in the story are the story. The fact that we do not know H's identity is part of what it meant to be gay in that time and place. You hid. You used initials instead of names. You protected each other by refusing to write things down. And that protection, necessary as it was, means that when historians come looking a century later, there is nothing to find, except the absence, the space where the name should be, the bench that 2 men sat on, one of whom we know and one of whom we do not, the photograph with half the image cut away, the diary entry that breaks off mid-thought. These absences are not failures of history. They are the history. They are what it looked like to love someone when loving them could get you killed, to want evidence that it happened, but also need to destroy that evidence, to build something real in a temporary space, knowing it could not last, and then to hold on to the memory when the space disappeared. Baden-Baden was full of those absences. The town was built on them. Every connecting door that is no longer there. Every bench that does not have a plaque. Every hotel register where the names were false. Every bathhouse attendant who saw something and said nothing. Every photograph where the second person has been cut out. The absences are the memorial. They are the only memorial most of these men will ever have. But there is one more thing, one more piece of the story that matters. In 1987, a group of activists in Berlin organized a project to document the lives of gay men who had been persecuted by the Nazis. They called it the Memorial Project. The idea was to collect names, stories, photographs, anything that could preserve the memory of men who had been erased. The project collected testimony from survivors. It searched archives. It put out calls for families to come forward with information about relatives who might have been gay. And slowly, over the course of several years, it assembled a database. Not complete, not even close, but something. A record that could be consulted. Names that could be said out loud. One of the researchers on that project was a man named Andreas Meyer. Meyer was himself gay, and he had lost his partner to AIDS in 1986. He threw himself into the Memorial Project as a way of processing his grief. He spent months in archives, reading through Gestapo files, prison records, deportation lists. He was looking for names. In 1989, Meyer travelled to Baden-Baden. He had read about the town's role as a pre-war gay haven in some of the memoirs and scholarly works that were starting to appear. He wanted to see if there were local records that might add to the memorial project's database. The Baden-Baden city archives were polite but unhelpful. They did not have records of arrests under paragraph 175. Or if they did, they were not accessible to researchers. Meyer was not sure if the archivist was being truthful or if he was protecting something. Either way, Meyer left empty-handed. But while he was in Baden-Baden, he walked the Lichtenthaler Allee. He visited the Friedrichsbad. He sat on one of the benches and tried to imagine what it had been like to be a gay man in 1905, walking these paths, feeling safe. To be a gay man in 1935, knowing that safety was gone. Meyer wrote about that visit in a 1990 essay. He described the experience as haunting. He wrote, "I sat on a bench in Baden-Baden and felt the weight of all the men who had sat there before me. Men whose names I will never know. Men who came to this town looking for a few days of peace, a few days of being themselves. Men who were hunted, arrested, murdered. I wanted to do something for them. Put up a plaque, plant a tree, something. But what do you memorialize when you do not have names?" That question, what do you memorialize when you do not have names, became central to Meyer's work on the memorial project. He realized that most of the men they were trying to honor would never be fully recovered. The records were too incomplete. The names were too often false. The families, even when they could be traced, often did not want to acknowledge that their relative had been gay. So Meyer and the other researchers made a decision. They would create a memorial not just to the men whose names they knew, but to all the men whose names they did not know. They would acknowledge the absence, make it visible, turn it into something that could be honored. In 1995, the memorial to homosexuals persecuted under Nazism was proposed for Berlin. It took years of political debate, fundraising, and design revisions. The memorial was finally installed in 2008 in the Tiergarten, near the more famous memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. The memorial is a simple concrete block with a small window. If you look through the window, you see a video loop playing on repeat. The video shows two men kissing. Sometimes it is two women. The video changes every few years, featuring different couples, but the structure remains the same: a concrete block, a window, a kiss. The inscription on the memorial reads, in German and English, "In memory of the homosexual men and women persecuted and murdered under National Socialism." Below that, with this memorial, the Federal Republic of Germany honors the victims of persecution and murder and intends to keep alive the memory of this injustice and send out a lasting signal against intolerance, hostility, and exclusion of gay men and lesbians. Baden-Baden is not mentioned on that memorial. The town is not named in the accompanying documentation. But the men who walked the Lichtenthaler Allee, who bathed in the Friedrichsbad, who knocked on connecting doors in small hotels, they are part of what the memorial honors. They are among the unnamed dead, the men whose names we do not know, the men whose photographs were cut in half, the men who exist now only as patterns in hotel registers and gaps in diaries. Andreas Meyer died in 1998 of complications from AIDS. He was 42. He did not live to see the Berlin Memorial completed, but his work on the memorial project helped make it possible. He was one of the people who insisted that a memorial was necessary even when the names were lost, especially when the names were lost. Because forgetting them twice, once in the camps, once in history, would be unbearable. There is a letter Meyer wrote to a friend in 1993, 3 years before his death. In it, he described a dream he had after visiting Baden-Baden. He dreamed he was walking the Lichtenthaler Allee, and the benches were full of men, old men, young men, all of them sitting quietly. He recognized some of them from photographs he had seen in archives. Others were strangers. He walked past them, and they nodded to him, acknowledged him, and he understood, in the dream, that they were waiting, not for rescue, not for justice, just to be remembered. Maya wrote, "When I woke up, I felt an obligation, not to save them, they are beyond saving, but to bear witness, to say, they were here, they loved, they built something fragile and beautiful in the margins, and when that thing was destroyed, they did not deserve it. No one deserves to be forgotten for the crime of loving." That obligation, to bear witness, is what this video is for. To say their names when we know them, to acknowledge the absence when we do not, to refuse to let Baden-Baden's gay history dissolve completely into silence. Because here is what we know. We know that for roughly 30 years, between 1900 and 1933, Baden-Baden functioned as a sanctuary for gay men. Not a perfect sanctuary, not a safe one in the absolute sense, but a place where, for a few weeks each summer, the rules relaxed, where men could find each other, where they could build relationships that had to remain invisible everywhere else. We know that hundreds, probably thousands of men passed through that sanctuary. Some came once and never returned. Others came every year for decades. Some found love. Some found sex. Some found simply the relief of not being alone, of sitting on a bench beside another man and not having to explain why that mattered. We know that the sanctuary was not built for them. The town's discretion was meant to serve gambling and adultery and the kind of casual moral flexibility that wealthy people expected when they went on vacation. But the discretion served gay men too. It sheltered them. It allowed them to exist in a way that was not possible in their home cities. We know that the sanctuary was destroyed, not gradually, not through neglect, but deliberately, violently, as part of a systematic campaign to erase queer existence from German life. The same hotels that had rented rooms to men like Ernst Waldheim and Dieter Hartmann handed their registers over to the Gestapo. The same bathhouses that had been places of intimacy became places of surveillance. The same town that had looked the other way in 1905 continued looking the other way in 1935. But now the direction of the gaze had shifted. We know that some of the men who had found sanctuary in Baden-Baden were arrested, imprisoned, sent to camps. We know that many of them died. We know that the ones who survived carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. We know that most of them never spoke about what they had lost, that they took the memories of Baden-Baden summers, the walks, the baths, the quiet evenings, the touch of another man's hand, and buried them so deeply that even their families never knew. And we know that the town itself moved on, that after the war, Baden-Baden was rebuilt, renovated, rebranded, that it became again a fashionable spa destination, that tourists came, took the waters, walked the same paths, sat on the same benches, and that no one told them about the men who had sat there before. No one said, this was a place where gay men loved each other when that love was illegal. This was a refuge until it became a trap. The silence was almost total. For 50 years, 60 years, the story of gay Baden-Baden was not told. It existed only in fragments, in the occasional memoir that mentioned the town in passing, in photographs that survived in attics and estate sales, in the memories of the very old, who were too afraid or too tired to speak. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s, when a new generation of historians began asking different questions, that the story started to re-emerge. Researchers like Klaus Müller, Jürgen Zander, Ruth Levinson, and Andreas Meyer went into archives and found the traces. They interviewed survivors. They collected photographs. They pieced together a picture of what had been lost. Their work is what allows me to tell you this story tonight. Without them, Baden-Baden's gay history would have disappeared entirely. The hotel registers would have been thrown away. The photographs would have been lost. The diaries would have been burned. And the men who built that temporary summer city would have vanished without leaving a mark. But the work of recovery is incomplete. It will always be incomplete, because the men protected themselves by erasing themselves. They used false names. They destroyed letters. They cut faces out of photographs. They did what they had to do to survive. And that survival strategy, necessary as it was, means that most of them will never be recovered. We will never know their names, never read their words, never see their faces. What we are left with is the shape of their absence. The hotel register with invented names. The photograph with half the image cut away. The diary that says H instead of a name. The bench where someone sat once and felt happy. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the absence is the memorial. Maybe saying, "We do not know who you were, but we know you were here," is the only honest way to honor people who spent their lives hiding. Because they were here, in Baden-Baden, in the Friedrichsbad steam rooms, and the Lichtenthaler Allee's rose gardens, and the small hotels with connecting doors. They were here, and they loved, and they built something real in the tiny spaces the world allowed them. They were here when being here was dangerous. They came back year after year, even as the danger grew. They sat on benches and touched hands and looked at each other in ways that meant everything. They walked together through a town that would not name what they were, but would not turn them away either. They took that tacit tolerance and turned it into summer after summer of stolen joy. And then they were murdered, or they scattered, or they survived into a world that had no language for what they had lost. But they were here. That matters. The fact that they existed matters. The fact that they found each other matters. The fact that Baden-Baden, for a brief window of history, was a place where that finding was possible. That matters. It matters because it shows that even in the darkest periods, even under laws designed to crush queer existence, people found ways to live. Not in the way they would have chosen, not openly or proudly or safely, but genuinely. They built lives. They loved. They created communities, however temporary. They refused to disappear entirely, even when disappearing was the only thing that could keep them safe. That refusal is the thread that connects the men of Baden-Baden to every queer person who has ever had to hide, to the lesbians who passed as friends or cousins, to the transgender people who lived in the wrong gender because transition was impossible, to the teenagers in small towns who taught themselves to recognize each other through tiny signals, to everyone who has ever had to translate their desires into code, perform straightness in public, and save their real selves for private moments with people who understood. Baden-Baden was one of those private moments, stretched across 3 decades and thousands of lives. It was not perfect. It was not enough. But it was something. It was a town where, for a little while, gay men could breathe. And if you are queer and you are listening to this, you are the reason that story matters. Because you are the future those men could not imagine. You are living in a world where, in many places, you can walk down a street holding hands with your partner, and the worst thing that will happen is that someone might stare. Where you can get married, where you can adopt children, where you can exist openly and legally and proudly. That world was built on the backs of people who did not get to live in it. On the men who were arrested under paragraph 175. On the women who lost custody of their children for being lesbians. On the trans people who were institutionalized and pathologized. On everyone who fought and hid and survived and died so that we could have what they never had. The men of Baden-Baden did not fight. They were not activists. They were not revolutionaries. They were just people trying to live, trying to find a few weeks each summer where they did not have to lie about who they were. And that trying, that insistence on living even in the margins, even in the gaps, even when the whole weight of the law was against them, that was its own kind of resistance. It was not enough to save them, but it was enough to leave traces. Enough that historians a century later could find the hotel registers and the photographs and the diaries and say, they were here, they loved, they mattered. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, I want you to think about those men, not as victims, though they were victimized, not as martyrs, though some of them died for the crime of being themselves, but as people. As men who woke up in the morning and put on their suits and took the train to Baden-Baden because they needed to. Because 2 weeks in a spa town was the only time all year they got to be real. Think about Ernst Waldheim, sitting on a bench in 1911, feeling genuinely happy for the first time he could remember. Think about Dieter Hartmann, knocking on a connecting door. Think about Martin Goldschmidt, waiting 3 days for someone who never came, and then walking away. Think about Albrecht Weiss, 72 years old, still walking the Lichtenthaler alley because he did not know what else to do. Think about the men whose names we do not know, the ones who appear in photographs as shapes that have been cut away, the ones who signed hotel registers with names like Franz Müller and Paul Adler, the ones who left no trace except a pattern in the archives, a suggestion of something that happened just outside the frame of history. They lived, they loved, they were erased, and tonight, for a little while, we are bringing them back. We are sitting vigil with them. We are refusing to let them be forgotten again. That is what sleep content can be. Not just relaxation, not just distraction, but a way of keeping company with the dead. A way of saying, you were alone then, but you are not alone now. We see you. We remember you. We honor what you built, even though it was destroyed. And maybe, if you are lucky, you will dream about them. About walking the Lichtenthaler alley on a summer evening in 1908. About the smell of roses and mineral water. About the feel of warm marble under your back in the Friedrichsbad. About sitting on a bench beside someone who understands you without words. About knocking on a door and having it open. About 2 weeks of being yourself in a world that spent the other 50 weeks demanding you be someone else. Maybe you will dream about that. And maybe, in the dream, you will turn to the man beside you and you will know his name, and he will know yours. And for that moment, in that dream, the absence will be filled. The photograph will be whole. The diary entry will be complete. And when you wake up, you will remember that they were real, that they existed, that Baden-Baden was real, that the summer city was real. That love, even when it had to hide, even when it could only exist in stolen moments in borrowed rooms, was real. That is the truth historians spend years excavating from archives. That is the truth that survives even when names do not. That is the truth that no amount of persecution or erasure or silence can fully destroy. They were here. They loved. And that love, however hidden, however fragile, however brief, was as real and as valid and as worthy of remembering as any love that ever existed. So tonight, we remember. We say their names when we know them. We acknowledge their presence when we do not. We sit with them in the steam and the roses and the quiet evening air. We keep them company because they were alone for too long, and we have the power now to make sure they are not alone anymore. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. May your dreams be free of hotel registers and false names and photographs cut in half. May you dream of benches in rose gardens, of hands touching in warm water, of doors opening when you knock. May you dream of a world where love does not have to hide, and may you wake up grateful that, for many of us, that world is starting to exist. Good night, and sleep well.